Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and yes, final part of our Chapter 22 lecture series for your textbook Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The End of the War. The focus question for this section is, how did the war begin to shape the post-war world? By 1945, American and British forces advancing from the west and Soviet forces advancing from the east had trapped Germany in a vice that ensured their surrender, and VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, came officially on May 8th of 1945. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, died, however, on April 12th of 1945, and his successor, his Vice President, Harry Truman, with war still going on in the Pacific, had to decide whether to use the atomic bomb that the Manhattan Project had developed. To end the war in the Pacific, the U.S. had to face a very profound decision. On the one hand, they could stage a full-scale invasion of the Japanese islands. And given what was understood about Japanese culture and the war in the Pacific itself, it was likely deemed that millions of Japanese and probably hundreds of thousands of Americans would die in such an invasion, as the Japanese would brook no surrender against an invading force. On the other hand, it could use this new atomic bomb that was developed by the Manhattan Project and pretty much end the war basically instantly. And that decision in mind, Harry Truman decided to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, and it did so in both the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing untold devastation to both of those cities. Within a week of dropping these bombs, Japan surrendered. The bomb remains controversial because it caused an enormous loss of civilian life, and never before had civilian populations been so ruthlessly targeted. Few people criticized Truman's decision in 1945, but doubts arose in the following years, and the debate still rages, particularly among historians, on the necessity of dropping the bomb. The so-called Big Three, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, met several times both during and after the war to try to establish some sort of agreement on the post-war power-sharing situation and the political and economic paradigm of a post-war world. At the Potsdam Conference, the Big Three established a military administration for Germany and agreed to place German leaders on trial for war crimes. The Yalta Conference established the post-war balance of power between the forces of democracy and capitalism and communism, and it established Soviet and communistic dominance in Eastern Europe in particular, planting the seeds of future conflict and setting up the Cold War era in this constant struggle between the forces of democracy and the forces of communism that would last for the next several decades. At the Bretton Woods Conference, leaders reestablished the link between the dollar and gold and created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. It was hoped by making the world economy more closely knit and interdependent, it would help prevent future conflicts. And the conference created the framework for the post-war capitalist economic system and recognized American dominance of world finance, with the dollar in particular being the go-to default currency of the world. In further efforts to try to prevent future world conflicts, especially on the scale of both World War I and World War II, the old League of Nations, which was established at the end of World War I, was transformed into the United Nations that we know today. This included a General Assembly, which included representatives of all nations of the world, and a Security Council with 5 permanent members, each of which had veto powers over any United Nations resolutions. And these initial 5 permanent members were the United States, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. The United Nations Charter outlawed force or threat of force to settle international disputes. All in all, these agreements established a radical redistribution of world power, with the United States and the Soviet Union at the top. Another document of profound significance at this time was the Atlantic Charter. Now, this was a document that was jointly issued by the U.S. and Britain. Soviet Union was not involved in this one. And it basically stated that the defeat of Nazi Germany would guarantee free trade, self-government for all nations, and a global New Deal, and established these post-war ideals of universal human rights that extended to all persons around the globe. And these sorts of ideals and the rhetoric of the Atlantic Charter inspired colonized peoples to adopt the language of freedom and self-determination, which over the course of the next few decades would inspire revolts against European colonial rule in Africa and Asia in particular. And with that, we conclude our lecture series for Chapter 22 of your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, I hope you learned a lot. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.